Hello, and welcome back to another section. And in this section, we'll be talking about some different types of vulnerabilities which are existing in the society, which can be measured. So we'll talk about some different dimension. And the first and the foremost and most comprehensive, or you can say, widely researched topic in terms of disaster vulnerability is the social vulnerability. So what is social vulnerability? So social vulnerability is basically the inability of the people or organization of the societies which can not withstand the impacts of different hazards, and these characteristics which are very much inherited into society as social interaction, institution, and cultural values, that is termed as social vulnerability. So what are the examples of social vulnerability? So what are the measures or the indicators for social vulnerability assessment? For example, the we talk about population density. So higher a population density in an area is more possibility that vulnerabilities might exist. Higher density, higher population existing in a particular society might result in higher damage in the case of a disaster occurrence. And why people are then being settled in very high risk area, like these are some flood prone areas or landslide prone regions in which people try to settle. So why do they settle? That are due to the social conditions apparent in the society. Then why people are building low quality housing, and why there is no uh, check being placed by the institutions. So that might be overlapping with the different context of institution as well as structure engineering, or you can say physical vulnerability as well. But usually it intersects with the dimension of social vulnerability as well, in which people are settling in, living in such living conditions in such a manner. The lack of mobility, some limited access to knowledges, or like possibly due to uh, the household health being, you can say, illiterate or not educated too much to seek out some knowledges for awareness and regarding a particular disaster. So that might be part of social vulnerability. Poverty, a very vital, you can say, important part of social vulnerability, in which poor people will be marginalized. They won't have proper access. They won't have financial mechanism. They won't have uh, that kind of condition would exacerbate, or you can say increase the social vulnerability of those households. Some other might be household size. A larger the sizes might be more vulnerable. Family type, like is it joint housing, single housing? So people living in single house might be more vulnerable as compared to the joint family system. How many male female ratio is there? The higher the this usually depending on scenario in which sometimes females are considered, especially in case of Pakistan, as more vulnerable than men, particularly due to limited access to resources, or you can say limited access to limited access to, you can say, institutional. So that in our society, so gender based might be considered as a part of social vulnerability. Household which have special needs, or people with disabilities, that might increase social vulnerability. Education level, people living in community, and people experiences with past disasters, for example, like floods or earthquakes, that might increase or decrease the vulnerability. So depending upon the situation, that might increase or decrease vulnerability. Another is the economic vulnerability. So here are some list down, but some different factors in which economic assets or process might be affected due to disaster. So at household level, we'll talk about the dependency ratio, that total earners divided by the total household total dependents is basically your dependency ratio. The higher the dependency ratio, the more is the economic vulnerability. Income plays a very vital role in assessing vulnerability of a household. Then people which have taken household can be deemed as more economically vulnerable than others. People residing in rented houses might result in higher economic vulnerabilities, limited or diverse livelihood sources might increase or decrease your economic vulnerabilities. Number of earning members. So more the earning members, lesser will be the economic vulnerability. And people which are living outside the hazard prone areas might decrease your economic vulnerability because their job will continue if they're living outside. And people with means of transportation, like household with basically assets. In Pakistan, the car, for example, is considered an asset. So that might be construed as a part of economic vulnerability. Some other vulnerability is organization vulnerability, for example, in which institution plays a very vital role in developing or affecting your vulnerability. So what kind of institution is there? How much are they prepared for it? How much effective is their emergency management system? Have they done the hazard or vulnerability or risk assessment of your area? That can be part of institutional vulnerability. And how the institution is responding to marginalized, socially and economically marginalized groups that can result in vulnerability. How much kind of planning system is there? How much urban planning is being, you can say, building control is over there. So is institution are following building regulations plan on ground or not? So that is a part of institutional organizational vulnerability as well. So these indicators are basically geared towards um, your urban flooding. So depending on your hazard or your area, these indicators might change. So these are very generic indicators, and these are not all the urban flooding indicators. A lot of literature has been already been done in which you can find more indicators depending on the hazard and context, and site-specific indicators can be found. Lack of proper risk planning, lack of proper implementation of already identified mitigation measures, like we call it corrective disaster risk reduction measures. So lack of already implementation of those mitigation measures can be can be a part of institutional vulnerability. Some other components, or you can say a part of vulnerability, can be used as how much enforcement or implementation of a particular area is, how much is effective your leadership is there, and is there any conflict in the like political biases are there or not, unequal participation, is the public being participate, how much public participation is apparent in the urban planning processes, and some conflicts, rumors, these kind of situations, are they acknowledging it or denying it, or like is it causing uh, institutions to not work properly, lack of just political processes and different dynamics in which how they respond for a particular disaster. Okay, but at household level, we'll talk about, like, let's say, did the every household in the people in the neighborhood have they received the warning about it? So it's a job of the institutions to give warning to each and every household parent in the city. Do the people know about the emergency shelter, or did the institution made that kind of shelter or not? So that is a part of institutional vulnerability. It is the job of the institutions to make people aware about possible evacuation routes, and how much have are the public awareness programs or drills conducted in an area, and are the people participating in it? That can be a part of institution. Political commitment, leadership, this kind of thing is very much important for institutional vulnerability assessment. And there we can have a very like comprehensive, we can debate on it how much political leadership is fundamental for effective disaster risk reduction, and like how much political reforms are apparent which can help in reducing the vulnerability. Another component is the attitudinal vulnerability, in which the community has a negative attitude towards adopting disaster risk reduction measures or adaptation or preparing themselves for a particular disaster. So the attitudinal vulnerability is there. So this includes the negative attitude of community towards change, uh, some different aspect of fatalism and hopelessness in people, in which our society become very much dependent upon the others, that other people will come and help us, and it's the job of other people basically to help us. So that is their lack of spirit of taking initiative. This is mostly a mental construct, also attributed or linked to the concept of risk perception. So attitudinal vulnerability is there, in which different beliefs, ideologies, or unawareness, and people are basically not ready to adopt some kind of precautionary measures against disaster. These also include that is people trusting the government or not? Are they going to the government or not? And do the community following the laws or not? Are the community cooperation cooperating in the disaster response? How much people are believing in a possibility of future occurrence of floods that will play a vital role in uh, making people take physical action or converting their physical perception into physical actions. That is there. Are they afraid of it, or do they worry about it? So worrying or afraidness of a level of factor is basically directly proportional to people undertaking some kind of physical action or precautionary measures or preparedness measures against a particular disaster. So people which are feeling like, let's say, for their life or other life, their own households or their family members, they are more acceptable to change their habits or start some kind of precautionary measures. Trust is also a very vital factor, in which even if the government started conveying the messages, if the people do not trust the government or the institutions, then there will be a lot of problem for the institution as well as the household as well. Then comes the environmental vulnerability, in which the vulnerability can be enhanced due to the particular conditions of the environment or lack of the environment existing in a community, like for example, degradation of soil, deforestation that might cause flood or a drought in an area, pollution of soils, groundwater bodies, or choking of nalas, or this we call it drainage canals. These might result in enhanced vulnerabilities. So it's some kind of environmental vulnerability is also there. Now then, a very we call it physical, some call it infrastructure, other people call it material. So this kind of situation is existing already, that how much is a physical characteristic of a building is ready to cope with a disaster. So how much the construction of a building is it maintained or not? Where is the location of the house, for example? What is the building type, height, age, distance to nearest difficulty? So as well as we could call it a part of like infrastructure vulnerability, like access to drinking water, sanitation, basic facilities or amenities. That can be a part of infrastructure vulnerability as well. So it can be also construed as structural vulnerability can be a component of disaster, in which construction materials, plan irregularities, vertical. Now these are some like call it civil engineering terms, in which we can find out uh, vulnerabilities of particular buildings through visual surveys. So we can have some kind of visual survey in which we can like have some kind of survey of each building, and we can have a rough estimate of structural vulnerability of an area. So these are some components of vulnerability. So these were the different dimensions. So let's another component or category is the tangible and intangible vulnerability loss. So here we are measuring vulnerability through in terms of damage assessment. So how many losses have been incurred? So the more losses have been incurred, the more vulnerable they are. So that is kind of a assessing in terms of damage loss assessment, in which some direct and tangible losses can be observed. That raises the question of how we're going to be measuring vulnerability. So how are we going to be measuring vulnerability in terms of losses of life? That that can be a part of vulnerability or not? So that is like we're talking about vulnerability as well. So let's skip this. Yeah. So there is another factor of internal and external vulnerability. Like we talked about Bohr's double structure vulnerability, in which uh, that model emphasized that there is two types of vulnerabilities caused by an inherent vulnerability like capacities and the inability of the communities or societies to cope with the disaster, as well as the external vulnerability in which external exposure is already there. So that is part of vulnerability. So internally, basically sensitivities and capacity, and externally is basically exposure. Another component is IPCC measure risk through hazard exposure and vulnerability. So vulnerability can be constituted or you can be subdivided into sensitivity or adaptive capacity. So exposure. So we've talked about in another lecture as well that exposure is basically uh, the presence of susceptible or presence of elements at risk can be your exposure. So it can be a physical feature of society which is apparent like household size. So we've talked about social vulnerability and we've talked about another dimension. So this is another component, you can say another contextual understanding of exposure. So when we were talking about in terms of social, economic, um, infrastructure, institutional attitude and vulnerability, that is separate dimension. That is separate, you can say, approach to vulnerability. Another approach is measuring vulnerability through exposure sensitivity and capacity. So it's the same indicator which we were using in different dimensions of social dimension, economic dimension. That indicators can be reused in terms of exposure. But here, those indicators will be chosen based on the uh, will it be a part of exposure, sensitivity, or capacity. Exposure is basically your physical features of society, economic systems which are affected by the potential hazard, and people which are uh, exposed to society due to, let's say, they are already vulnerable due to economic change, like poor people are already there, and another aspect of climate change is being added, so double vulnerability or double exposure is present for those. So what kind of system is already in the area? Household characteristics or economic system. So another is your sensitivity. So predisposition or of the elements which can have harm. So a tendency or degree of element risk is sensitivity. So here we can quantify these concept of gender, age, income, which were now these age, income, which were not classified into social vulnerability or economic vulnerability. These can also be reclassified into sensitivity as well. Then is the capacity assessment. So that is a very vital component of vulnerability assessment, which is counteracting the effect of vulnerability is the capacity assessment, in which all hazards will not turn into disaster if we have very good capacities. So uh, these capacity assessment is a very like kind of exercise in which we can find out how can be how can the capacities of different individuals can be enhanced to reduce the impact of different disasters. So it can be defined as is the community potential ability to withstand disaster due to presence of material human resources to tackle or prevent a disaster and respond to it very much effectively. This includes all the different skill sets of the people which they have developed over time, which can be helped in reducing the impact of disaster. So that can be at the level of population, people, organization, or institutions or systems, and which we can reduce in case of emergencies. So two definitions we in IPCC mostly to an approach of adaptive capacity. We call it as a system which can respond successfully to climate change variability and its adjustment in behaviors is called capacity. So here we can call it income, past experiences, different insurance mechanisms, already preparedness, and emergency plans. So that can be a part of capacity. Another reclassification of vulnerability is outcome vulnerability or contextual vulnerability. So outcome vulnerability is basically a resultant of projected impacts due to climate change. So due to exposure of the social aspects. So outcome vulnerability is like we calculate our outcome in terms of climate change. We calculate the vulnerability and then we counteract by, uh, let's say, developing or assessing the capacity. So outcome vulnerability is equal to your, uh, let's say, social vulnerability divided by the capacity. So that is outcome vulnerability. Then is your contextual vulnerability, in which climate is considered or can be observed through different dimensions. So here in this type of vulnerability, we can reclassify outcome vulnerability into, let's say, exposure sensitivity and capacity, and contextual vulnerability we can uh, reclassify in terms of social economic and dimension, social economic infrastructural dimensions. So two different types of vulnerabilities. Then is reveal vulnerability is basically the vulnerability which is only present without understanding the capacities. So that is called reveal vulnerability. So thank you very much.